Hey, everyone. Welcome to the folks who attended last time, and for the folks who are attending for this time. This is the FYI Academy for class FYI Academy, and this is the one on classification. This is the second out of three series for classification. My name is Stephanie Philippe Parker, and I'll be your facilitator for today. Not too long ago, we had the first session where we discussed the role of a classification specialist. And today's going to be part two, where we're going to be going over classification tools and resources that a classifier utilizes in their role. So let's jump right in. Next slide, please. Excuse me. For our agenda for today, we're going to have a brief recap of session one, kind of go over with classification terminology, tools and resources for both the general schedule and the wage grade, and then talk about the last session for this series and then take questions. I'll give a very brief introduction. Again, my name is Stephanie. I am a senior, pardon me, I'm a senior classification specialist here at FYI. I've been here for almost 10 years, and I've been a classifier for about 17 years. I currently serve as a specialist for the United States Coast Guard at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. For today's presentation, some of you may be sort of like learning something new, or this may be just a refresher for some of you. For classification, the information that OPM provides can be a bit inundating. It's a lot. So I've tried my best to sort of sort through some of the important pieces to kind of share with you today. Everything is important, but we're going to kind of go over things at a high level here today. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end. And then if something comes up later on that you might have thought about later, I'll also give you my email address, and then you can also post questions. I think it's called Simpler on our FYI intranet website. All right, next slide, please. Excuse me. In a brief recap of session one, we sort of discussed what classification is. So this is a good place to start. According to the United States Coast Guard, position classification is a process through which federal positions are assigned to a pay system, series, title, and grade or band based on consistent application of position classification standards. Again, you will just sort of find this definition is fairly consistent across all federal agencies. It's essentially the process by which classifiers determine what a position is. What pay plan does it belong to? What series does it belong to? What series does it qualify for? And then determining the grade of the band according to the classification standards. Next slide, please. Also in session one, we went over the primary responsibilities of a classifier. The two primary roles are to evaluate positions and then also to serve as advisors to hiring managers. We discussed a little bit about how roles may differ at various agencies, but at the core, these are the primary responsibilities of a classifier. To evaluate positions, to make sure that they're graded properly in accordance with the classification standards, and to just work with hiring managers to make sure that they understand what goes into the process of getting them that ultimate position description, which they can get on then with hiring and things like that. So in discussing what classification is and the key roles and responsibilities of a classifier, we can sort of now get into like the tools and resources that a classifier uses in order to perform their job. We'll first sort of start by going over common terminology that's used in the classification arena. Next slide, please. All right. Some of the common terms or acronyms used in classification, you've probably seen these before: PD, position description; KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, which you mostly will see for staffing specialists through vacancy announcements; the factor evaluation system, which is FES; and then OPM, obviously, which is Office of Personnel Management. We briefly went over these during our first session, so you may see them used today as well. So we're just defining them again, just in case some of you may or may not be aware of them. Next slide, please. One of the first terms as we get into classification terminology that's very likely commonly used for most of you is called the GS, the General Schedule. It's a classification and pay system utilized to cover white collar positions. It includes professional, administrative, and technical and clerical positions. And just as a note, OPM notes that there are about 1.5 million white collar federal employees worldwide. GS positions are typically salaried, and they're typically described as white collar. White collar work, as you may know, is typically performed in an office and has limited physical requirements. In the classification world, OPM sort of breaks down GS positions into four types of work, as we mentioned here: professional, administrative, technical, and clerical. So let's briefly kind of talk about each of these. Next slide, please. Excuse me. All right. Professional work. The first type of GS work that we're going to talk about is professional work. It requires knowledge in the field of science or learning characteristically acquired through a degree. And so some examples of professional positions are entomologist, or an accountant, or a civil engineer, all of which require sort of like that specialized knowledge required to have higher education. Excuse me, typically these positions will be graded like at the higher end of the grading scale. And I realize that we haven't really talked much about what that looks like as far as the grading and things like that goes. We'll kind of get into that in the last session. Professional positions are at that higher end of the grading scale, require a very specialized knowledge and a degree. Next slide, please. Administrative work is the next one, which is probably the most familiar area of work that most of you may be, it's a more common area of work that OPM utilizes. It involves the exercise of analytical ability, judgment, discretion, and personal responsibility. You have to know principles, concept, practices of an administrative field. Some examples I threw in here are investigative analyst, a legal administrative specialist, and a management and program analyst, which is very common, at least here at Coast Guard. This is the most common area of work under the general schedule. It incorporates a vast number of jobs and grades. With the example shown here, you can see a little bit how administrative positions kind of vary across different areas. So this is what makes this group of work the most common. Next slide, please. So the third area of work here is technical work. This involves extensive practical knowledge, sort of gained through experience or specialized training that kind of comes like less than what a college graduate or a degree would sort of have. It involves substantial elements of the work of both professional and administrative fields, but requires less than full knowledge of the actual field involved. Examples are medical records technician, supply technicians, or library technician. These are sort of like quasi, maybe hybrid jobs where you may not have that specialized knowledge or degree, but you will have that specialized training, maybe equivalent to someone that has an associate's degree. Next slide, please. This is the last area of work here, which is the clerical work. This work involves basically supporting just kind of what you would think clerical work would do. They sort of like support folks in an office, business, or fiscal operations. They're verifying documents, maybe processing transactions, maintaining records, dealing with deadlines, things of that nature. Some of the examples I listed down there at the bottom are sales store clerk, or an insurance account clerk, or like a security clerk. I would even sort of consider clerical positions as starter positions. They are typically graded very low. And if you think about a career ladder or a career path, this is typically where someone very junior would sort of enter the workforce. Then after that, they would move up to that technical position, and then that administrative position, and then potentially that professional position. So now we want to kind of find out where a position falls if they are not white collar. So we went over all four categories of the general schedule. And if they are not considered white collar positions or performing any of these four types of work, then they fall into the pay system called the wage grade. Next slide, please. Excuse me. The federal wage system is a uniform pay setting system that covers federal employees who are paid by the hour. The system's goal is to make sure that everyone that is performing trade craft or labor type of jobs receive the same rate of pay for performing the same type of work. Examples are painter, plumber, sheet metal mechanic, things of that nature, positions of that nature. Depending on the agency, wage grade positions may be far and few between. Or if you're at another agency, they may be the core work that that agency or organization is performing. For example, up here at the Baltimore Yard, you'll likely find like more wage grade positions at GS or administrative positions because they're working in an industrial yard. They're responsible for performing work on ships, buildings, and sort of blue collar type of projects. Blue collar jobs obviously differ from white collar positions in that the work is more manual and more physical and typically performed in a factory, shop, or construction type of area. So as we go through the rest of the presentation today and some more terminologies, we will be moving back and forth between general schedule and sort of wage grade types of work. So it's important that we know the difference between the two types of work that we just discussed. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Another term that we're going to go over in the classification arena is called a job family. This term is just simply utilized for both general schedule and wage grade work. And for GS positions here, it just covers a group of related white collar occupations or series. Excuse me. In the example here on the slide, you'll notice that this particular job family has a few things in common. The jobs listed are related to inspection, investigation, enforcement, and compliance. And the 4 digits that you see are called the series. And they all start with a 1-8, which means that they are all in the same job family. We'll sort of get into the series in just a little bit. But sort of knowing and understanding the job family and the related series can really help a classifier know what other options are available within that job family when classifying a position description and in sort of comparing the jobs within a particular job family and then ultimately determining the final classification of a position. Next slide, please. As it relates to wage grade positions, job families are very similar, but they're described as it relates to blue collar work, obviously, trade, craft, and labor occupations that are related in more ways than one. So as you can see in this particular example, here we're talking about the woodworking group. The 4-digit series are similar in that they all start with the same 2 digits. Again, this is sort of done on purpose to sort of easily show the positions belonging to the same job family. In this example, OPM is determined that these 5 positions are similar in nature and likely have some sort of element of woodworking involved in the core performance of their duties. And perhaps even the skills and knowledge required between these jobs are easily transferable. Just like the positions with the general schedule positions, job families here are just so important as well. It helps classify sort of focus the review in a particular area and provides awareness about the various position possibilities during a review. I sort of mentioned during the first first session for classification, that it truly is impossible for a classifier to know every possible job that OPM has described, both within the general schedule arena and for the wage grade positions. These job families are just another resource for us to utilize to learn about the work and to ensure a position is properly classified. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Similar to job families are occupational groups. Occupational groups are a major subdivision of the general schedule, embracing a group of associated or related occupations. Essentially, occupational groups are just a bigger group of related occupations. For instance, you will have the occupational group here of accounting and budget, which is the GS 500 series. And then below this group, you may then have a job family job family of tax examination or accounting and budget work. Maybe a familiar analogy may be a human resources organization, which is the occupational group. And then below that, it's broken down into maybe classification, staffing, benefits, labor relations. Those would be the job families. Next slide, please. So we briefly kind of mentioned earlier about the series. You've probably seen these with position descriptions. They all have them. It is essentially a subdivision of an occupational group or job family consisting of positions similar as to a specialized line of work and qualification requirements. I'm sure, again, like you've all seen these right after the pay plan, it'll either say GS and then the series or WG and then the series. These are designated by OPM to simply describe the work and subsequent qualifications for that particular job. For general schedule positions, sometimes by even looking at the first two digits of a series, you may be able to tell what occupational group or what occupational family it belongs to, which in turn may help you to understand what that position may be doing even before you look at the position description. Here on the examples, there's two. The top two here are the general schedule or white collar, and again, 343 management program and analyst, which may be familiar or more popular at other agencies. 2210, which is IT management. And the bottom two here are the wage grade or blue collar work, which tool making, the series is 3416, and then forklift operating, which is 5704. Next slide, please. Another term and resource widely used by classification specialists are the classification standards. These are issued by OPM to relate the grade level definitions in Title V to specific work situations and provide the basis for assigning each position the appropriate title, series, and grade. We'll sort of get into Title V in just a moment. However, position classification standards basically encourage uniformity and equity of classification by providing an established standard for common reference to use across all of the federal agencies. If you go to the VA or Department of Labor or to Army, we are all using the same classification standards to classify position descriptions. It is essentially the specific tool we use to evaluate and determine the appropriate grade of a position. For both general schedule and wage grade positions, OPM has a large list of classification standards to be used. They are series dependent, which means that once an appropriate series has been determined for a position, we locate that associated classification standard and follow those specific guidelines to then evaluate and determine the grade for that position. Across some of these standards, some occupational groups and job families may share the same evaluation criteria or standard, and this just simply means that the work is similar enough to be evaluated by the same guidelines. Next slide, please. All right, hopefully this shows up pretty okay. I just kind of wanted to show two examples of the table of contents for a classification standard. On the left is for paralegal specialists, which is a GS 0950 series. It is the first page of the table of contents for the classification standard for this particular series. Most standards will follow the same format for their table of contents, where it just provides a series definition, exclusions, guidelines about the appropriate titling, a grade conversion table, and then the factor level descriptions. For this particular example, the standard also provides what they call OPM benchmark descriptions, which are essentially samples of what positions might look like at certain grades. On the right, you have the wage grade classification standard for a WG4204, which is a pipe fitter. In this example, it sort of goes over similar areas as the general schedule, which is it gives a series definition, work not covered, and appropriate titling. Unlike the general schedule positions, the wage grade classification standard just simply gives guidance for what the typical grade or grades should be for a particular series. In this instance, they're providing guidance for one grade only for pipe fitters, and that's the WG10. And other grade standards, wage grade standards, you may see varying grades. OPM allows us to grade a PD below or above that grade, but only really gives guidance for what you typically should see given a particular area of work. Overall, these standards are classifiers' go-to as it relates to evaluating positions. They are sort of the bread and butter of what we utilize to review, evaluate, and justify why a position was classified a certain way. Next slide, please. All right, so we just defined and sort of went over what a classification standard is and what it's utilized for. However, classifier has a few other tools and resources that are provided by OPM to help us do our job. But before we get into specifics, it's important to sort of know how classification is governed. The rules of classification are set forth by the Classification Act of 1949, Title V of the U.S. Code, Chapter 51. It governs the classification of positions in the federal service. It dictates how positions shall be classified based on the duties and responsibilities assigned and the qualifications required to do the work. This is the Title V U.S. Code that was sort of mentioned earlier. And this law just dictates across every agency very specific rules, regulations, and guidelines that are to be used in the performance of a classification review. So let's sort of get into some of those guidelines and resources briefly. Next slide, please. One of the first resources a classifier utilizes is the Introduction to the Position Classification Standards. This just provides background information and guidance regarding classification standards for general schedule work only. It describes the fundamental policies for which managers, supervisors, and personnel need to understand in using classification standards to determine the title, series, and grades of positions. This guidance is one of the first, this guideline rather, is one of the first items I recommend reading if you really want to know what classification is all about. Just like its title, it truly does provide an introduction to classification. It defines terms, explains how to properly use the classification standards, and essentially goes into a variety of topics that impact how we are to make certain decisions during the classification review process. Next slide, please. So here we have the table of contents for the introduction to the classification standard. As you can see, it sort of goes in depth about a lot of different topics, such as classification appeals, the primary standard, two-grade interval positions, and so on. While all these things are important and may be unfamiliar to you, they have a lot of content in there that is truly helpful. And it may be a little bit foreign sometimes, sort of reading through a lot of this information. We won't get into it today, may touch on some of these things, but all of it is equally important as we sort of learn how to properly classify a position. Overall, classifiers are governed by all of these guidelines, all of this content, and we're responsible for not only understanding them, but applying them appropriately during the classification process. Next slide, please. The next resource we'll kind of discuss is the Classifier's Handbook. This handbook is an important tool for classifiers to refer to regarding most things classification and as it relates to the general schedule. It sort of goes into detail about what to do if we have a position where there's not a classification standard that has been established, how to determine like relationships between each of the 9 factors, and just an overall understanding of all of the elements to consider when reviewing a PD and determining the appropriate title, series, and grade. The Classifiers Handbook in general just governs the classification of positions in the federal service. It's a law that states that positions shall be classified based on the duties and responsibilities assigned and the qualifications required to do the work. Next slide, please. Excuse me. All right, so here we have the table of contents for the Classifiers Handbook that we were just talking about. It kind of goes over a few of the things that I just mentioned. The handbook essentially explains what to consider when classifying a PD. It provides a guide on how to make an appropriate determinations and what considerations should be made when performing a review. One part of the handbook that I refer to on a regular basis is if you see chapter 3, where the FES, or the 9 factors that we're typically used to seeing in a GS positions, they're defined here. And working with management, this area is really important and sort of helps serve as a reference for them, and explaining the purpose of each factor and explaining what type of content should go and should not go into a PD. Overall, this handbook is a great resource for classifiers to use to assist with making classification determinations. Next slide, please. Earlier, we discussed occupational groups and job families. OPM actually provides an entire handbook that discusses and defines each group, family, and series, and that information is described here in the Handbook of Occupational Groups and Families. For both GS and wage grade positions, it defines the occupation and it lists the series and the names, and just basically tells you what kind of position each series should be. So next slide, please. We'll kind of take a look at what this handbook has included within it. On the left-hand side is a page from the handbook that we just discussed. This example shows 3 different groups of work, and under each group are their associated series that belong within that group. For example, you'll see that we have the GS 600 group, which is the medical, hospital, dental, and public health group. It includes about 45 different series that belong within this group. And by grouping these series together, OPM is saying that all of these positions are similar in nature. In this instance, they are probably likely performing work in the medical, hospital, dental, or public health areas. On the right-hand side here, sample is a snippet of a series definition that OPM has defined. This is where OPM is explaining to users what type of work a specific series is responsible for performing. Having this information is critical in analyzing the specific kind of work a position is responsible for performing and comparing it against what OPM has defined for that series. As a classifier, we likely do not know the difference between a practical nurse and a nursing assistant, but OPM does, and we must rely on them to define the requirements for both. So again, having this handbook plays an important role in making just one out of the many decisions as it relates to the proper title, series, and grade for a position. Next slide, please. One of the last tools and resources classifiers typically use are called functional guides. These guides are used to determine the grade of broad categories of federal white-collar work classified under the general GS classification system. Next slide, please. Kind of show you what a functional guide looks like and explain it a little bit more. These are the 19 functional guides that OPM provides. These are to be used in tandem with the associated classification standard. For instance, if we have a supply management specialist, that classification guide will direct us to use the supply functional guide listed here. As you can see, these guides provide a wide range of varying types of positions, from leaders and supervisors to equipment and policy types of jobs. And just like with the classification standard we discussed earlier for each series, these functional guides also provide the parameters for evaluating and grading a position. As with the other tools we discussed earlier, these functional guides are essential tools in helping us to make the proper classification determinations. So these functional guides, along with the classification standards, are important tools again, and just sort of helping us to sort of properly grade a position during the review. Next slide, please. As with general schedule positions, wage grade positions also have a few resources for classifiers to use. So we'll get into that a little bit. But just for today, we're just going to go over the main two resources that are typically used as it relates to blue collar positions or wage grade positions. Similar to the general schedule, the wage grade system also has an introductory handbook, and it's called the Introduction to Wage Grade, Federal Wage Grade Position Grading, Introduction to the Federal Wage System Job Grading System. And it just basically includes a framework of key ranking jobs to serve as the basic peg points of the grade structure, job grading standards to provide criteria, job grading methods to assure consistency, and then a plan for coding and titling trade and labor jobs. Next slide, please. So on this next slide, we have the table of contents for the introduction to the wage grade positions. You can see here that they provide an outline of the grading system and the methods to how they work, titling, etc. Unlike general schedule positions, wage grade positions do not utilize the FES 9-factor system. You'll remember before that they provide what OPM designates as the general or typical grade of a specific series. And this handbook provides guidance and sort of how to interpret that and evaluate a position that may not fall into that grading pattern. Two things I just kind of wanted to note about this particular guide. The table of contents has a second page that I did not show here. It provides an appendix that kind of shows a wide variety of trade jobs and their most common grades and what that work may look like. This further helps the classifier to truly analyze the work and provides a point of reference when determining the most appropriate grade. The other thing I wanted to mention is that you'll note at the top right of the table of contents, you'll see that this is dated from 1968, then 1970, and 1981, which means this is old, and that's okay. This just means that the first time that this guide was established was in 1968, and the last time that it was updated was 1981. Across the board, specifically with wage grade positions, I have not noticed that the standards are changed often. And this is just likely due to the work not changing. Excuse me. Techniques and tools may change, but the work itself may not have. For instance, a painter's job is not likely to change much, just like a forklift operator's job is likely pretty consistent throughout the years. So I just wanted to kind of point that out because OPM will continue to make updates to its guidelines and classification standards, but only when the work has significantly changed. And most times you will see this happen with the general schedule positions and not the wage grade positions. Next slide, please. The last wage grade resource that we'll kind of reference today are the functional guides. Just like with the general schedule, OPM provides functional guides to determine the grade of the broad range of categories of trade, craft, and labor works for jobs classified under the federal wage grade system. For these positions, you'll see that they're almost broken down into titles, if you will, helpers, inspectors, leaders, supervisors, etc., which is common across blue collar type jobs. Almost similar to how we were talking about clerks, technicians, administrative professional. These are more with helpers, inspectors, leaders, supervisors. So in the same realm of that. These are the categories that OPM provides as a separate reference and grading point outside of the classification standard. This tool is important for consistency purposes as well as understanding the differences between the varying levels of work. Next slide, please. Like I flew through that. So today we have discussed a lot as it relates to the many tools and resources that a classifier has access to and utilizes on a regular basis. All of this information that was presented can be found on OPM's website. Along with the information presented in session one, I really do hope this has provided like a high level overview of all the resources and guidelines that OPM provides to make thoughtful and lawful classification determinations. Our last session, session three, will be an overview of the classification process itself, showing how the classification process works and kind of how we do our job from a high level. How do we get to a GS-15 that everybody wants? Sort of how we grade a PD. So that's going to be the last session. Next slide, please. Here, I'm just happy to take any questions that anybody may have at this time.
I, Stephanie, actually have 4 questions that I've been collecting as we've gone through all of this. So first, thank you so much. It was really informative, and me having so many programs that have classification specialists, I've realized classification is kind of like an art and a science, right, with that interpretation. So I guess the first thing is, I'm assuming everything is digital now, the handbooks and the updates and everything like that. So does everybody use like a website to access all these tools?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, OPM has a website. You can literally just Google OPM classification and it'll take you to exactly where all the resources are that we went over today. So and then you can like save them. It's so much information out there. So they have links for you to follow. So yeah, everything is right there on the OPM website.
And so that's available to anybody, right? It's public.
100%. Yeah.
Another question is, so it seems like a lot of the work is interpretation. So is that why, you need a certain amount of years into the position to have that skill set to interpret all of these tools and resources appropriately? Or is it very, very clear of like, X equals X and Y equals Y? Or like, can you tell me a little bit more about that interpretation part that you talked about?
Yeah, for sure. I think depending on who you may ask, I mean, some people may say that, classification is subjective, but I do think that there is just so much information out there. To a point, it can be, but the content that OPM provides is very, very, very specific. I think that if you have positions that are very straightforward, they can be interpreted the same way by the same person every single time. But I think the years of experience and then just sort of kind of knowing what other options are available, maybe knowing about appeals that have happened in the past. It's a side note, if you feel like your position isn't classified properly, you can make an appeal. OPM may even change their classification parameters or standards, but having all of these appeals are documented online, and it gives a classification specialist another tool to utilize to say, I remember something about this, it was very similar. And so having that experience also helps you to make maybe a different determination than someone who may not have known about that. But I do think that the content is the content, and I think that, like, again, like straightforward positions may not require a lot of thought, but there are going to be like what we call mixed positions, or positions that may not be as straightforward, where you may have to like kind of dig deep and just kind of know where to look to get more information. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Oh, you did, which leads, perfectly into my next question is, so does it seem like in the classifier community, there's like niches of the type of roles classifiers are really experienced in classifying, or is it more of kind of like, since all these tools are at your fingertips, classifiers can kind of just like step in and classify any sort of positions?
no, you as a classifier, you should definitely be able to classify any position.
Interesting.
I think that if sort of like how we talked about earlier, like if you're at Baltimore Yard, right, and you have all of these positions that are forklift operators, plumbers, and so forth, you're not familiar or as familiar with the white collar positions that may be office jobs. And so while your experience is all in the wage grade positions, you should still know how to classify a admin position or administrative position. You just haven't had to do it a lot. It's the same sort of mindset, but it's just a different kind of process, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
depending on where you are and like what agency you come from, you could have like a whole ton of knowledge in one particular area or one particular series. Like I think I helped one time with one of the museums was doing like a lot of positions with art and museum work. I don't know anything about that. But OPM does, and I had to like really sort of dig in and be like, what is this position supposed to be doing with art exhibition? I never had classified a position like that before. But as classifier, you know exactly where to go to find that information so you can do a good job. Yeah.
Okay, and then my last question, thanks so much for being patient with me, is
Yeah.
so how does somebody get into classification? Since, it seems like so much is being familiar with all of these tools. Like, how did
Yeah.
you get your start in classification? Or let's say somebody here at FYI is the HR assistant and they're really interested in becoming a classifier. Like, do you have any recommendations or
For
experience on how
sure.
people make that jump?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I would say there's two ways that I would recommend. The way that I came into it is I had a mentor, someone who had been doing it for a long time, and they was really patient with me, and they showed me how to do it. Um, and that's how I kind of got my feet wet. The other way to do it, excuse me, is I can't think of um, the name of the place, but they somewhere in DC or wherever you may be, even online, they offer a ton of classification courses and classes, which I've also taken, which are super helpful. And they go down very specific information about how to specifically classify. So I think either of those routes would be good, but also just finding, someone who may be patient with you to sort of sit down and be like, hey, you want to do this one together? Or what do you think about this? Or just sort of asking questions. So if someone is interested in classification, sort of finding that expert or someone that you sort of trust that you know will do a good job to show you the way. Yeah,
Awesome. Thank you so much.
of course. Thanks for the good questions. Could you go to the next slide? I'm just going to put up my information. Unless someone has more questions now, I'm always accessible. I don't know if there's anything in the chat or if anybody has anything else, but I'm happy to answer them.
I don't have any questions. Just wanted to commend you for a job well done. This is really good. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. We'll be posting this on my FYI. You can ask questions there. You can contact Stephanie directly. And yes, just like Daryl said, fantastic job. I learned so much and look forward to the next session. Thanks.
All right. Thank
Thanks
you.
a
I
lot.
appreciate it. All right. See you guys next time.
Thank you.